Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel, whether you're watching this on Facebook at NDE Ireland or if you're watching it on YouTube at the Nomadic Warrior. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that came up during the week. Some people out there on the Facebook on a particular group that I'm a member of were discussing whether or not NDEs are illusions, and they were referring to some apparent research out there that was used to justify this. Okay, let me get to the end right before I get to the beginning and explain this. First of all, near-death experiences are not illusions. Spiritually transformative experiences are not illusions. Sorry, they're not hallucinations. NDEs and STEs are not hallucinations. They are separate from that. And if you look to the works of Dr. Bruce Grayson, himself a psychiatrist who spent 40 years researching near-death experiences, he explains it all in there. And someone who is an experiencer myself and a mental health professional, I can tell you, those who are going through what we refer to as hallucinations, their experiences are very different from those who go through near-death experiences and spiritually transformative experiences. So I'm Charlie Bannon. I'm a mental health social worker. I work in the mainstream mental health service in Ireland, and part of one of my projects, part of my work is, let me also say I run NDE STE Ireland, which is an affiliate member of IANS, the International Association of Near-Death Study. I run that here in Ireland. So, and just to let you know, as part of my work within the mental health service, which is part of the Health Service Executive, the HSE, and I'm not here talking on behalf of the HSE. My contract with them doesn't allow me to do that, but I'm just here talking. Part of my work is to bring the science of near-death experiences into the mental health service in order to avoid misdiagnosis. But and that's endorsed by clinical director where I work within the mental health service. Endorsed and encouraged, I would add. But anyway, I've seen people discussing out-of-body experiences with their psychiatrists. I've seen them talking about spiritually transformative experiences of spiritual healers, and the conclusion by those psychiatrists were that those people were not mentally ill. Okay, and this is people just looking at purely at the science, okay? Professionals who don't particularly, as far as I'm aware, have an interest in near-death experiences or spiritually transformative experiences. But just by looking at the Diagnostic Statistical Manual version 5, or the DSM-5, and also looking at the ICD-10, which is the International Classification of Diseases version 10, those experiences, it was concluded that people were describing were regarded as not mental illness. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, if you want to know the science behind that, Dr. Bruce Grayson's book After, published I think it was in 2021, it summarizes his 40 years of research. Okay, and in there you'll find lots of reference to research that Dr. Grayson did. He wasn't particularly setting out to prove that NDEs were or were not mental illness. He was just seeking the truth, and he came to the conclusion that they are not mental illness. And he was challenged from time to time, by people who believe that maybe it's to do with chemicals in the brain, maybe they're all hallucinations. Well, he came to the conclusion, like anytime, and I've said this in other videos before, but anytime he was challenged, and he welcomed the challenges, he welcomed skepticism, he welcomed anyone who would try to find the flaws in his research. And they would say, well, I don't think it's this, I think it's that. And he would say, okay, well, let's research that, let's get evidence. And he came to the conclusion every time that near-death experiences are real and that they are not mental illness. Okay? Now, there's other research out there too by Dr. Peter Fenwick, by Dr. Pim van Lommel, and others. I don't know them all, but if you want to know the science, it's there. You can find it. Look up scholarly articles on near-death experience on Google or whatever browser you use. You will find it there. Now, there was a documentary going around on Netflix within the last year, which I looked at, where a neurologist, and I can't remember his name, he was trying to see if it was possible to recreate a near-death experience. Now, from what I recall, he came with the assumption that near-death experiences are caused by the brain. Dr. Bruce Grayson has well proven that near-death experiences are not caused by the brain. Near-death experiences are nothing to do with the brain. But anyway, this guy, and I cannot remember his name, I don't know if the documentary is still on Netflix or not, but he looked at what he regarded as certain features of near-death experiences purely from the point of view of stimulating the brain. And there were about 5 or 6 different categories, and he tried to see if it was possible to create conditions that would stimulate certain experiences. And yeah, he had some degree of, well, let's say he had results, but he started out with the assumption that near-death experiences are caused by the brain. Now, they are not. I was not impressed with his research because he left out so many different factors. Dr. Grayson looked at people who had near-death experiences whose brains at some point during physical illness were so damaged that they couldn't possibly have produced consciousness. Yet these people recovered and they came back with the very explicit details of experiences, near-death experiences, and accounts of what they experienced, even though their brain was medically declared to be incapable of producing consciousness. So one of the big conclusions there is that consciousness exists despite the brain, not because of the brain, but despite the brain. It's if your brain is working or not, your consciousness is working. And I've had that experience myself, having had brain damage when I had meningitis a few years ago. It took 2 years to fully recover. But say during the first 6 months of recovery, my consciousness was perfectly fine, but I couldn't find simple words to describe things like book or cup. I couldn't find basic words, but I knew what the cup was, I knew what the book was, and I had sort of had an experience where somebody really upset me, and I was really, really upset, but my consciousness was looking at myself that was upset, It's difficult to describe. It's like having an out-of-body experience, but being within the body. And I've had a colleague in the past who worked within the mental health service who had to, excuse me, they had to speak to somebody who had severe dementia. And when you have dementia, it's possible sometimes that people will have moments of lucidity. So she went to a nursing home to ask this person if they were willing to sign a document. But if the person was not lucid, their signature on that document would mean nothing, okay? So she had never met this person before. She stood outside the room in which they were staying and tried to connect to them on a spiritual level, spoke to them telepathically, spoke to the person telepathically on a spiritual level. And explained, my name is so-and-so, I'm from the mental health service, I'm here to ask you if you're willing to sign this document, but I cannot ask you to sign it unless you have moments of lucidity, that you are conscious of what you were doing. So this person who had dementia, severe dementia, after she spoke to him telepathically at a spiritual level, she walked into the room. This person who had never seen her before called her by her name and said, "Oh, you want me to sign something?" So the person was lucid during those moments and signed the document, and moments later was back to being severely impacted by dementia. So these are just some examples. Consciousness exists beyond the brain. And if you've had a near-death experience, I always say this: if you had a near-death experience or a spiritually transformative experience, you don't need the science to prove any of this. You know it already, okay? But the science is for those who have not had those experiences and who question whether they are real or not, okay? And so Plato spoke about this a long time ago, possibly, I don't know, roughly 2,500 years ago. He said everything starts at the spiritual, comes into the world of thoughts, comes into the world of emotions, the world of feelings, then comes into the physical world. So, and people talk about that now as well. It's discussed in cognitive behavioral therapy. Well, they don't mention the spiritual part, but they do talk about thoughts impacting your feelings, and your feelings impacting your behavior, okay? But let me put it this way, okay? Okay, hopefully we're all familiar with radios at this stage. Like, a radio channel exists. Let's say the radio channel is consciousness. And the radio is like the physical body, and tuning it in, it's like the mind. Is it tuned in? Is it not? Okay, radios nowadays, they tune in automatically, but a few decades ago you had to turn a knob in order to, you would have a lot of interference, and eventually you would tune into a channel. Now, just because that radio gets damaged and can no longer tune in, or all you can get on it is interference, doesn't mean that the channel is not there. Well, similarly, our spiritual consciousness is there, is there whether we are able to tune into it or not. And we could not exist. We could not exist physically if we did not exist spiritually, okay? But if you do like that guy, that neurologist in the Netflix documentary, and he's trying to basically what he was doing by studying the brain alone, it's like he was looking at the radio, he was looking at the receiver within the radio, and trying to see if he could create a radio channel by looking at the physical thing of the radio, or the receiver that receives it, Now, he did get some results. I believe he created some hallucinations, but hallucinations are not near-death experiences. And as Dr. Bruce Grayson says himself, and as many of you will know out there already, probably the best way to understand the difference between near-death experiences, spiritually transformative experiences, and hallucinations is to look at the after effects, the impact it has on somebody's life, the changes that they bring into their lives, So people are, after a near-death experience or a spiritually transformative experience, people are generally more compassionate, more kind, more respectful. They have an affinity with other human beings, no matter what their race, religion, skin color, where they live on the planet, where they're from. They have a deeper meaning in life, whereas somebody with hallucinations, they don't necessarily change. Now, as Dr. Grayson points out, it is possible to be diagnosed with what we understand to be a genuine mental illness, and also to have a near-death experience or a spiritually transformative experience. The two are not mutually exclusive, but the two are different. The two are completely different things. Okay? So near-death experiences and spiritually transformative experiences are as common within the population that do have diagnosed mental illness, and with those who have no diagnosed mental illness, okay? So there are two separate things. And let me just talk about mental illness for a moment, or what we understand to be mental illness, okay? There is no shame or stigma in having those experiences, okay? Well, a lot of people believe there is, but there's not. I challenge that. I think anyone who's going through such an experience, first of all, it's not your fault, and there's huge evidence to show that mental illness, as we call it, is very much impacted, influenced by trauma. If we could remove trauma from people's lives, abuse and so on, if we could remove trauma, we would have very few people attending mental health services, or very few people needing supportive mental health services. And that brings me on to Dr. Daniel Amen, also a psychiatrist from California, around the Los Angeles area. And he has a book called The End of Mental Illness, and he talks so much about so many things beyond medication, the impact of life on people, how the impacts of life can impact people's mental health, either positively or negatively. And also I think of Peter Bullymore. He is the founder of the National Paranoia Network in the UK. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he spent 10 years in a psychiatric unit in a hospital in Sheffield. Now he travels the world educating mental health professionals such as myself. I attended a couple of his lectures over the years. He has a completely different take on schizophrenia, which he was diagnosed with. He says that the trauma that he experienced in his life, the trauma of sexual abuse, had a massive impact on him. And he had horrible thoughts about himself. And those thoughts, he says, took the form of voices. And so he hears the voices of 3 people who abused him when he was a child. And he's learned to deal with the trauma of that, and he continues to hear those voices, but it doesn't trouble him anymore. Not so much. It doesn't impact his life so much. He's a whole new way of understanding schizophrenia, which he says doesn't exist. But he helps educate mental health professionals such as myself all around the world about helping people to deal with trauma in order to deal with mental illness. Now, the interesting thing about Peter, and I say this, I mention his name publicly because he is public about it. You can look him up online. There's 2 other voices he says he has heard in his lifetime. One inspired him to write a book, a children's story book, and the other is the voice of his deceased mother, who he can call upon anytime, and he can ask his mother a question, and that voice will give him accurate information about things that are going to happen in the future, or about things that are going on, and then when he checks it out, that's the way it is. So, for example, he was told by his mother's voice when his granddaughter would be born, right down to the exact time and the exact day. And he spoke to his daughter, congratulating her on becoming a mother, and she didn't even know she was pregnant at the time. But his granddaughter was born exactly at the time that his mother's voice told him. So that got me thinking, there's, you cannot call that mental illness, when it's a voice that tells him accurately what's going to happen, from time to time. So he's someone who has this genuine spiritual connection, and also hears the voices of people who abused him. He still hears the voices, and I asked him would he prefer to be rid of the voices now that he's able to deal with his life, and that it doesn't impact on him. I asked him would he prefer to have those voices gone, and he said, yeah, I think it would be weird to live in silence, yeah, it would be strange not to hear them at this stage. So I guess I'm jumping around on a lot of different topics, but what I'm trying to do is reduce confusion and trying to bring clarity to a topic. First point is that near-death experiences, spiritually transformative experiences, are not created by the brain. Our consciousness is deeper than the brain, and the brain is a filter. It's a filter of that consciousness, but it filters it in a limited way. Okay. Another thing is that you cannot understand a near-death experience or a spiritually transformative experience simply by studying the brain. Okay? If you focus only on the brain, you'll get nothing. You get nothing. Okay? Another point is that there is no shame in having a mental illness. Okay? It's not your fault. Mental illness, a huge part of the cause of mental illness is trauma, and trauma that nobody would ever choose. You know, nobody in human form would ever choose the traumas that we've been through. Okay, from a spiritual point of view, we can say that we plan our lives, but that's from a very different perspective. But anyone going through trauma, they, at a human level, you would never choose that. So there's no shame. Also, near-death experiences and spiritually transformative experiences are not mental illness. It's possible to have a diagnosed mental illness and also to have a spiritually transformative or a near-death experience. It's possible to not have what we know as a mental illness and also to have a spiritually transformative experience and a near-death experience. But NDEs and STEs are not mental illness, okay? They're not the same thing as hallucinations, and I have been working with people since 2010 with people who do have hallucinations, who do have diagnosis of mental illness. It's my job. Part of my job is to help them grow and develop their quality of life, whatever their experience. Okay, so that's it, coming from an experiencer and a mental health professional. I hope you find this helpful. I hope it helps to clarify some things. Excuse me. Thank you if you've been watching up to this point. Please like, comment and subscribe. Yeah, and join me on Facebook too, or on YouTube, wherever you're seeing this. Okay, have a beautiful day. Love, love, love. Wishing you everything good.